What we're going to do is continue graphing sine and cosine curves. What we did last time was we focused on our vertical translation or our midline, and that's our constant value. It shifts the graph either up if it's positive or down if it's negative. It changes the horizontal center of the graph. Now, the amplitude is either a vertical compression, that means it gets smaller if our a value is in between 0 and 1, or if it's a vertical stretch if our a value is greater than 1. And the a value is the number in front of either the sine or the cosine. So with this graph, what we're going to do is we're going to come up with our chart, and we have our 0, pi halves, pi to 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi. Our sine values that we work with are 0, 1, 0, -1, and 0. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to write a linear equation, y equals 3, and then we're going to plug all of our values in there. We're going to start with the 0. 3 times 0 is 0 minus 1 is -1. Then when we plug in a 1, 3 times 1 is 3, minus 1 is 2. When we plug in a 0, same thing as before. 3 times 0 is 0, minus 1 is -1. Then when we plug in a -1, 3 times -1 is -3, minus 1 is -4, and then back to 0 again, so that's going to be -1. So when we're looking at this, what we're going to do is we're going to label our graph. We're going to make sure that it ends at 2 pi, and then I'm going to go up 4 and then down 4. And I plot my points. So I have 0, -1. I have 2. I have back to -1, and then -4, and then back to -1. So this right here is my graph. What you'll notice is that my midline is at -1 because of the -1 right here. Notice that there's a maximum that has a distance of 3 and a minimum that has a distance of -3. So looking at our next one, what we're going to do is we're going to come up with our chart again. This time it's cosine. So when we're looking at cosine, what we have is 1, 0, -1, 0, and 1. That's our pattern for cosine. We're going to write our linear equation, y equals 2, and then plus 1. We're plugging in each of our values in for the cosine. So our first one is 1, 2 times 1 is 2, plus 1 is 3. When we plug in a 0, 2 times 0 is 0, plus 1 is 1. Then what we're going to do is we're going to plug in a -1. 2 times -1 is -2, plus 1 is -1. And then back to 0. When we plug in a 0, we're going to get the 1 again, and then the 3. And so we're going to go all the way to 2 pi, and then we're going to go up 3, and then we're going to go down 3. So we have 0, 3. We have pi halves is 1, then to -1, and then back to 1, and then back to 3. And that right there gives us our graph. Once again, if we're looking at this, we see that our midline is at 1 because our constant value is at 1. And notice that the distance from the middle to the peak is 2 because our amplitude is 2. Now this next one's a little bit different because we have a negative cosine value. So what we're going to do is we're going to see what happens. And so we have 0, pi halves, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. When we plug in our values, what we have is y equals negative. We're going to plug in all our values in for cosine. And so our cosine values are 1, 0, -1, 0, and 1. So when I plug in a 1, that's -1 minus 2, which is -3. When I plug in a 0, it's -0 minus 2, which is -2. When I plug in a -1, negative and a negative make a positive, and that's -1. When I plug in a 0, it goes back to -2, and then back to -3. So when I'm looking at this, once again, I'm labeling my graph. I'm going to end it at 2 pi. I'm going to go up 3, and I'm going to go down 3. And so when I'm plotting this, what I have is 0, -3, -2, -1, back to -2, and then -3 again. Notice that this time with the cosine curve, what's happening is that it's starting at the bottom and it's going up. And that's specifically because of the negative. The negative flips the direction of the curve. Okay, pause the video and try the next 3 on your own and see how you're able to do. So we're going to start off with our table again. So we have 0, pi halves, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. And our sine values, we're going to use our sine values in order to solve this. We're going to plug them in. So when we plug them in, we're starting off with our 0. That would be 2 times 0 is 0, minus 3 is -3. The next sine value is 1. 2 times 1 is 2, minus 3 is -1. Then we go back to 0, which would be -3. Now we go to -1, and that would be -5. And then we end back at the same spot where we left off. So 0 and 2 pi are always going to be the same. I'm going to go up to 5 and down to -5. When I'm plotting my first one, I go to -3 and then -1, back to -3. I go to -5, and then I go back to -3. So notice that we have our cosine curve. Notice that once again, our vertical translation or our midline is always based off of our constant value. And then since my amplitude is 2, notice the distance between the midline and the peak is a distance of 2. Now for the next one, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to fill out our chart. 0, pi halves, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. The one that we care about the most is how it ends. So that way when we have our graph, we're going to make sure that we end it at 2 pi. Now when we write this equation, we have y equals negative, and then we put parentheses. We're replacing the sign with each of our sine values. So sine starts off at 0, and so that would give us a 2. Then it goes to 1, and that would be -1 plus 2, which is 1. Then it goes back to 0, and then it goes to -1, and negative is a positive, so that would be a 3, and then it ends off in the same spot. So when we graph this, we have 0, 2, 1, back to 2, we have 3, and then back to 2. And so here what we have is our sine curve. Notice that our sine curve is negative. And so notice that the sine value is now going down instead of up. And our last one. If we're looking at this one right here, one thing that we notice is that we don't have a constant value. So that means that our midline is going to be at 0. Notice that there's no adding or subtracting. So what we're doing is we're taking our cosine values, plugging them in, and we're multiplying them by -3. So our first one is 1, so that would be -3, then 0. Then we plug in a -1. Negative is a positive, so that's a +3, back to 0, and then to -3. So when we're plotting this, what we notice is that 0, -3 to 0 to +3 to 0, and then down to -3. And then what we're doing is we're drawing our cosine curve. Notice it's going the opposite direction because it's negative.